cut your video. Thank you. Please just cut your video so that then you won't be on video. But if you are happy to appear on video, and this is an international event, then you are most welcome. And then in the meantime, before we begin, I know that we have an international audience. It would be such a wonderful thing for you to let us know where you are joining us from today. I know that we have people joining us from Zambia. We have people joining us from the United States. We have obviously people joining us from South Africa. Please use the chat function just to write down the name of the city and the country from which you are joining us. It's always wonderful to know which countries and which cities are represented at our events. So please just use the chat function to let us know where you are joining us from. We are expecting quite a large audience this evening. So I'm going to ask you to be patient with us as the team lets people into the Zoom. So it is just 1 minute past 7 p.m. South African time. So I'm going to wait maybe 2 more minutes before I officially open the webinar and hand over to Dr. Leon Hartwell to begin his presentation. So let me just see, maybe some people have introduced themselves to us and told us where they're joining us from. I know we have Renee Pozniak, our colleague and friend Renee Pozniak, who's joining us from Johannesburg in South Africa. We have Saul Roth, who's joining us from London in the UK. So welcome, Saul. We have also Dora Asher, who's joining us from Toronto, Canada. We also have, it is an honor, it is quite an honor for us that today we are joined by Holocaust survivor Pinka Scooter, who's joining us also from Toronto, Canada. What an honor once again to be joined by Mr. Pinka Scooter, and thank you for your continued support. I know you've attended many of our webinars and many of our events. What an honor to have you here. So thank you very much for that. Thank you. So I'm just going to, and so to those of you who are joining us, who are survivors, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to honor us with your presence. All Holocaust survivors who are joining us this evening, and all survivors of genocide who are joining us this evening. Thank you very much for this great honor. We also have Ronnie Silberman, our friend Ronnie Silberman, who's joining us from Johannesburg. Thank you, Ronnie. And then we have Mark LeBlanc, who's joining us from China. So as I said, we have quite a large audience, but also an international audience. So it's a thrill to host all of you tonight. And just in case, for those of you who've just joined us, I'm just going to repeat briefly the housekeeping rules that I would like you to keep in mind. Please make sure that your sound is on mute throughout the event so that we don't have any background noises that interfere with tonight's presentation. However, please use the chat function to communicate with us, to tell us where you're joining us from, as many people are doing right now, but also to post your questions for Dr. Hartwell. And then the team will gather those questions. And then towards the end of the event, we will have a session, a Q&A session that Dr. Hartwell will be very, very happy to answer your questions and address your comments. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen right now so that maybe we can see one another. And I just need you to be aware that this event is being recorded. So if you wish to hide yourself from the world, please just cut your video. However, if you are comfortable to be seen by the world, by all means, please keep your video on. So Dr. Hartwell is the non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, which is also referred to as CEPA. His 2019 doctoral thesis analyzed the use of mediation in the resolution of armed conflicts. And tonight's event is simply titled Raphael Lemkin, father of the G word and also an extraordinary negotiator. So Dr. Hartwell will unpack the creation or the coining of the word genocide and also speak about the man himself, the man who coined the word genocide, Raphael Lemkin. So it is now 5 minutes past 7 p.m. South African time. And so it is my pleasure, it is my privilege as well to introduce to you Dr. Leon Hartwell to speak to us. So Dr. Hartwell, the Zoom floor is all yours.
Thank you, Mdu, for that very wonderful introduction. And thank you all for joining me. It's a great honor to have such an international crowd. I think I'm hearing my own voice. I'm not sure if someone has their speaker. Okay, it's gone now. So that's been solved. Thank you. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. It's really wonderful to engage such a diverse audience from all over the world, everywhere from South Africa to China. It's just great to see such an interest in Raphael Lemkin. I would like to begin by first just thanking the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center for giving me this opportunity. It's not the first time that you have given me an opportunity to engage something that is very dear to my heart, the issue of genocide. In August 2008, the Johannesburg and Holocaust and Genocide Center gave me the opportunity to go to Rwanda on a study tour where I was able to meet with many genocide survivors. And I think such opportunities really give us a sense of the real world. You know, I thought about a genocide prior to that in terms of numbers, you know, where 800,000 people killed or 1 million people killed. But, you know, being able to shake hands and to listen to survivors really drives home the point that people are also affected at an individual level as much as this is a group crime also. So I also want to specifically acknowledge many of the survivors who are also tuned in for this discussion. So thank you for that. Now, I'm going to be focusing on Raphael Lemkin, and I've become quite obsessed with him over time, not only because of my interest in genocide, but one of my other side interests is also in negotiation. So I'd like to focus on that. I'm not sure why I'm not seeing my presentation. We tested it out earlier and now I'm not seeing it on my screen, but if you could just bear with me for 1 second, please. Okay, let's see. All right, can you see my Mdu? Thank you. Okay,
Yes.
Excellent. So let's start with Raphael Lemkin. Here we go. Okay, so on the 28th of August in 1959, there was a man who collapsed of a heart attack in the public relations office of Milton H. Blow in New York City. And by some accounts, he died shortly thereafter at a nearby police station. In Samantha Power's book, she claims that there were 7 people at his funeral, although this fact was disputed by someone who was at the funeral. I got really interested in this idea of 7 people at this funeral of this man, Raphael Lemkin, who died of this heart attack at the early age of 59, it should be noted, because it gives the impression that he was a very lonely figure, that he didn't have many friends. Maybe he was a poor communicator. I think the truth of the matter is that he was a great negotiator. He was very strategic also how he went about it, because he was very successful in terms of what he set out to achieve. And we'll talk about his goals later on, but his main goal at an early stage was to criminalize genocide under international law. So Raphael Lemkin was born in the year 1900, and he grew up in a village that was close to Volkovisk, which is in what is today known as Belarus. However, borders changed quite a lot in that part of the world, especially during that period. But Raphael Lemkin styled himself as a Polish Jew. It's one of the facts that he kind of downplays is his Jewish identity, especially in later years. And I think he did that strategically as a negotiator, because he was still negotiating with individuals who were still not who in their own country still discriminated against Jews. But we can circle back to that issue later on. But it's quite likely that he definitely heard about pogroms in nearby areas near his village, and I think those images of Jews being killed left quite an impression on him, no doubt. One of the things that really had a big impact on Raphael Lemkin was after he read Quo Vadis. It was a book written by Henryk Sienkiewicz, and the book focused on Emperor Nero and how he fed Christians to the lions. And Lemkin wanted to know at the age of 11. He turned to his mom. He said, "Mom, why aren't the authorities intervening to stop these atrocities?" And it became a question that he became obsessed with, this idea of crimes that were taking place against people, not because of what they did, but because of their identity groups that they belonged to. Now, it's interesting because this book, Quo Vadis, Where Are You Going, is quite a door stopper. It's about 200,000 words long. At the age of 11, typically today, kids would read Harry Potter. It's much lighter reading compared to what Lemkin preoccupied himself with. But about 3 years later, after he read this book, he was already reading Paul Nietzsche. I think he spoke at least 3 or 4 different languages 4 years later. So he was a very, very smart kid and concerned with a lot of heavy subjects at an early age. So eventually he went to study philology or linguistics in Lvov, and but early on he changed course. He was initially obsessed with studying language as something that would serve him quite well as a negotiator, as I will argue later. But and at the age when he started studying philology, I think he was already fluent in about 5 to 7 languages. But he changed course. He wanted to study law because he heard about and read about the Armenian genocide, and he became quite interested in the trial of Sogomon Terillian, who murdered Talat Pasha. Talat Pasha was one of the Ottoman Turks who was quite instrumental in the Armenian genocide. And so Lemkin turned to his professor and asked him why a man is put on trial for the murder of one person, but someone like Talat Pasha, who was responsible for about 1 million deaths, never was put behind jail and never put in jail. And Lemkin's professor responded basically that it wasn't a crime that Talat Pasha committed, because there's no such crime that was there's no such crime under international law. You have to keep in mind that the word genocide did not exist at that time. So it's something that Lemkin later on coined only, you know, in 1943, 1944. So Lemkin at this time, as a young student, decided that this is going to be his life's goal. So, you know, to criminalize genocide, a word that did not exist at the time. So in the 1930s, Lemkin was a legal practitioner, a writer, and a professor. And it should be noted that he was also a public prosecutor in the early 30s in Warsaw in the district court, which was quite significant, especially given that he was Jew in Poland during that time. Not long thereafter, you know, the Poles were exploring, you know, what to do with their local Jewish population, and even came up with ideas of sending all their Jews to Madagascar, a plan that was later adopted by, a plan that was later on also explored by the Nazis. So in 1933, Lemkin created this pamphlet on what he called barbarity and vandalism. I mentioned earlier that there was no such word as genocide at the time, but if you roughly look at the definitions of what he called barbarity and vandalism, it corresponds to a physical genocide, like killing, and vandalism corresponds to what we would call cultural genocide today. So anyway, so he set out to present this pamphlet of his at the League of Nations Conference on International Criminal Law in Madrid, but the Polish authorities prevented him from attending that conference. So instead, he sent copies of his pamphlet to this Madrid conference. These ideas were not well received at the time. I think people struggled to see why it was so important to criminalize these crimes that did not exist. Yeah, Lemkin still thought it was oops, I'm sorry. Lemkin conceived that you know, the Armenian genocide wasn't something that just happened in isolation. He looked at history and he said it's happened many times in the past, and therefore it can happen again. His work was interrupted when the Nazis and the Soviets invaded Poland. As you know, you know, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union negotiated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of 1939, and not long thereafter they invaded Poland on the 1st of September. Lemkin was really good, you know, in terms of having a sense of the moment. You can see that a few days after the Nazi invasion of Poland, he fled Warsaw on the 6th of September. And I think that sense of the moment is also one of the things that served him really well as a negotiator. He knew when to push for ideas, when other parties were receptive to his ideas, or when they were lukewarm. So after he fled Poland, he made his way to the Baltics and then to Sweden. And as you can see, well, as you might know, the Baltics at that time were still not yet engaged in the war. So he was buying time for himself. But what he did whilst in the Baltics is that he started this letter writing campaign. He was very well known for his letter writing campaigns. He would seek out particular individuals and appeal to them to help him in whatever quest he was partaking in at that time. And so one of the individuals that he reached out to in the Baltics was a former Minister of Justice, I want to say, from Sweden, and he asked him to help him acquire a visa because Sweden was neutral during that time. Eventually, things panned out, and he arrived in Sweden. And within 5 months of arriving in Sweden, he learned Swedish. As I mentioned, he had a real knack for learning languages. He was a polyglot, and within 5 months of arriving in Sweden, he started teaching international law at the Stockholm University. At that time, he also collected a number of Nazi decrees and ordinances, and he went very smartly about this. He tapped into his network. He had this incredible network of companies that he worked for in his previous, in prior years as a lawyer, and he would ask these companies with offices in other parts of Europe to send him information about any Nazi decrees and ordinances. And Lemkin, being Lemkin, then studied these documents carefully and translated them from German into other languages so that they can be accessible to other individuals. He also thought by collecting these documents, they can later on be used to show systematically that there was an intent to, to destroy people because of their identities that they belong to. And later on, it came in quite handy during the Nuremberg trials, I should say. One of the other individuals that he then reached out to whilst in Sweden was Professor Malcolm McDermott. And McDermott was an American who worked with Lemkin on a book in previous years. I think the two of them translated the Polish, Polish law into English to try and get a sense, or to make it accessible to the American audience. So he knew Malcolm McDermott from that particular project. And he asked him if he could help him to get to the US to obtain a visa, maybe even a job, which McDermott eventually succeeded with. So Lemkin then made his way to the US by going through the Soviet Union and Japan, and eventually arrived at Duke University in 1941. I think on his way, making his way to Duke University, was still doing his normal thing where he was learning the language of the country that he was destined to go to. So he was still studying his dictionary, trying to build his English vocabulary. And so by the time he arrived at Duke University, the first day he arrived there, was asked to give a speech. And during that speech, he was appealing for the US to do more to stop Nazi Germany in its tracks. Then from there, he also took a trip to Washington, D.C., where he met an individual called John Vance, who was a librarian at the Library of Congress. Yeah, Vance also helped him a lot because he agreed that he would, for example, provide a space for Lemkin where Lemkin could send all these documents that he's collected over time. I think he also gave him a PO box so that people could send additional documents there for posterity. And Vance, of course, also introduced him to a number of very prominent individuals in his Washington, D.C. network. So eventually, Lemkin then got a job with the U.S. Board of Economic Warfare. And that was important because one of the individuals on this board was Vice President Henry Wallace. And Lemkin thought this was a great opportunity to go, to pitch his idea of, outlawing these atrocities against identity groups, get someone at a very high level to adopt this idea and carry it through. So he studied everything about Wallace, and he knew Wallace was very interested in agriculture. And, whenever he got together with Wallace, he would talk a little bit about his time on the farm. His father was a farmer, but he soon realized that Wallace was not interested in criminalizing atrocities against identity groups. So Lemkin decided, well, who else is there that he could talk to? And eventually he was able to pitch his idea to FDR, Roosevelt, right? And Roosevelt was also lukewarm to this idea. He told Lemkin to be, quote unquote, patient. And Lemkin, of course, was unhappy with that, because he thought, while people are being slaughtered, the response is not to be, quote unquote, patient, So Lemkin, being Lemkin, always sought out ideas of, well, who are the people who would influence some of the decision makers? That's how he went about his negotiations. So he thought, well, who influences the president of the United States? And he turned to the American public. So he started a massive public campaign to try and get the American public behind this idea of criminalizing crimes against identity groups. And one of his first efforts was a book that he wrote called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, which was published in 1944. This book was significant because let me just mention that Winston Churchill in 1941 said, "We are in the presence of a crime without a name." And Lemkin took it upon himself to forge a name for this crime without a name. And I think he came up with this idea of genocide around 1943 or 1944. But in 1944, definitely, that was the first time when the word genocide appeared in print, and it was in this book of his, Axis Rule. Now, Axis Rule was quite a hefty book, about 700 pages. It was dry with legalism. He incorporated a lot of the Nazi texts that he collected in Sweden into this book to show that there was a crime that was taking place. But one of the chapters, he introduced this idea of genocide. And this is where, the Lemkin, the polyglot, really came into play. Like, he understood the importance of language. So he combined the Greek word genos, meaning race, tribe, or religious group, and side from the Latin, which means killing or destruction. And you can see, if you look at this particular document, that's a little note that was that this was found among his belongings, and there you can see he clearly scribbled a number of words there, struggling to figure out which was the perfect word to describe this crime. And he was also toying with this Polish word there, the bojowstwo. I struggle to pronounce that one, and Völkermord from the German, the killing of a nation or a people. The problem that Lemkin envisaged is that he wanted a word that could not be mispronounced. So he wanted a short word. He wanted a word that would resonate with a lot of people, like the word Völkermord. He thought might be too closely related to people thinking about Nazi atrocities. For him, this was broader than what was happening during the Holocaust. And he wanted to communicate that to many people. So he came up with genocide. Then in terms of his book, Axis Rule, it wasn't, he was never going to win a Pulitzer Prize with that. As I mentioned, it was dry legalism at play in that book. But he also listened to some of his critics, and some of his critics said, well, you should, condense your ideas, and you should more strategically focus on certain individuals, reach out to them. So he wrote shorter op-eds about his ideas. He appealed to particular individuals. One of the individuals that he reached out to was, of course, Robert Jackson, because he heard that Jackson was going to be the chief prosecutor for the US during the upcoming Nuremberg trials. So on the 16th of May 1945, there was no word genocide that appeared in any of the possible crimes for indicting Nazi leaders. And so he started this lobbying campaign, starting with Robert Jackson and other members of his team, to include the word genocide in the Nuremberg Charter. And by the 18th of October, so between May and the 18th of October, he actually managed to persuade the American team to include the word genocide in the Nuremberg Charter. So it appeared under count 3 under war crimes. And what's significant is that they used this word genocide almost lock, stock, and barrel from the definition that Raphael Lemkin used in his Axis rule. However, that was only a small victory for him, because 130 days into the actual Nuremberg trial, there was no mention of the word genocide. So Lemkin again employed this letter writing campaign. He appealed to people like Eleanor Roosevelt and Lee, who was at the time, at the United Nations. And so he was trying to get them to back this idea of convicting these Nazi criminals specifically for what he deemed the crime of genocide. So eventually, after putting a lot of pressure or appealing to some individuals in his network, he got an invitation to physically go to Nuremberg. He met with Jackson and some members of his team, and eventually we saw this trend where the word genocide then became sprinkled throughout these trials, and it was used at least 15 times during the Nuremberg trials. However, at the end of the Nuremberg trials, Lemkin collapsed. It was a very stressful time period for him. He also found out that virtually all of his family members were lost in the Holocaust. So it was also personal for him. I think 59 of his family members perished in the Holocaust, and only his brother and his brother's wife and 2 of the kids, I think, survived. So he collapsed from exhaustion. His work from his work working on trying to promote his idea of genocide, and the personal stress that came with it, and ended up in hospital in Paris. And then he listened to the radio, as the proceedings of the Nuremberg trials concluded. And although several Nazis were convicted of crimes against humanity and war crimes, there was no mention of genocide. And Lemkin described it as, quote unquote, the bleakest day of my life. Because I think one thing to understand is that international law, one of the sources of international law is, what happens in tribunals or courts. And so because none of them were convicted for genocide, he knew that was not good for trying to create international law around criminalizing genocide. So he took a different avenue, because another source of international law is treaties, right? And so he actually campaigned really hard for getting the United Nations to adopt Resolution 96, which recognized genocide as a crime under international law. And Lemkin was very active in drafting the Convention on Genocide. He also extensively lobbied a range of individuals from different countries to accept his ideas on the Genocide Convention. One of the individuals that he formed a particularly close relationship with was also Doc Evatt, who was, I want to say, the president of the UN General Assembly at the time. And Evatt frequently plotted with Lemkin to try and set the agenda in a manner that would favor, this formation of the Genocide Convention. So on the 9th of December 1948, the UN finally adopted the Genocide Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And we can circle back to this, but it's important to see here that genocide, according to the convention, is defined as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So it's not just the killing of a specific group of people, but also the destruction of them. And this was very important for Lemkin because he didn't want it to just be confined to the killing of certain individuals. But if, for example, you take children from one group and put them in another group, that also destroys their culture, that could destroy part of who they are. And so it's not just physically killing individuals. After the Genocide Convention, Lemkin again realized that many of the great powers around the world were not that in favor of ratifying the Genocide Convention, and he knew that he needed at least 20 countries to sign up to the Genocide Convention. So he then started to focus more and more on Latin America and the Middle East in particular, because especially with Latin America, he felt that some of those smaller countries depend on international law for their existence. And there were many Latin American countries that were part of the United Nations. And so he lobbied them, and he thought if he could get a number of smaller countries to sign up to the Genocide Convention, then some of the middle or great powers would have to follow suit later on. So eventually the Genocide Convention entered into force on the 12th of January in 1951, as I mentioned, after 20 plus countries ratified the convention. And then I'll finish here and open it up for questions. But on the 28th of August, as I mentioned, Lemkin passed away. He died largely in poverty, and he became more and more recluse in the last few years of his life. I think the great thing about Raphael Lemkin is that he could have done a range of things. He could have been a history professor. He could have been, he could have continued to practice law. He could have been a great lobbyist. He could have done any of those things. He could have made a lot of money, but he dedicated his life to criminalize genocide. And before we conclude, he was at this Milton and Blow office in New York City in order to promote his memoirs, Totally Unofficial, which was never published while he was still alive. The publishers thought that it's not interesting, his life was not interesting enough for the public, to read his book. And he was also working on a number of other papers and books that were not published during his lifetime. But in more recent years, I think especially after Samantha Power wrote her book on genocide, Lemkin became more and more of an interesting individual to the public at large. And suddenly, we saw that researchers dug into the archives, found some of his manuscripts. I think there are at least 20,000 or so pages of his letters and notes and things that researchers can access these days, to get a sense of who was Lemkin, how did he go about what he was doing, what was he trying to achieve. so we definitely see the surge of interest again in Raphael Lemkin. I think Raphael Lemkin is still really relevant today because, you know, in the 1990s, we saw a number of conflicts that escalated, especially in the former Yugoslavia, especially in Bosnia with the Srebrenica massacre. And then also, of course, in Rwanda, you know, where we also witnessed the genocide in 1994. And I think as a result of those tribunals, there was again a big push to try and establish a permanent court to specifically to prosecute acts of genocide. That's what led to the negotiation of the Rome Statute, and later gave rise to the International Criminal Court when the Rome Statute was activated after the necessary ratifications. So today we have 120 states that are part of the Rome Statute, but there are many great powers that are still missing, that have not yet signed up to this permanent court to prosecute acts of genocide. I think, you know, Lemkin's work is still also important, and you know, he was not naive. He didn't think that the genocide was immediately going to stop genocide, but he thought it was important that we at least identify genocide as a crime under international law to in the future act as some form of deterrence. In the 21st century, we've seen a number of genocides. I think Darfur is something that a lot of us talked about earlier in this century. And today we're talking more and more also about the Uyghurs in China, and talking and discussing whether it's genocide or not. So I'll leave it at that for now, and then open it up for some questions before I talk more about Lemkin. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hartwell, for that impressive, fascinating, and eye-opening presentation. Thank you very much. My first question, and I'm sure many people in the audience will begin to post their questions, and I do encourage them to start doing that. But we often, in the previous slide that you showed where there were tombstones of different genocides that have occurred in history, the one, the genocide against the Herero and the Nama people in Namibia, I didn't see that. I'm sure maybe it was in some of the hidden tombstones, because there were more tombstones there. But this brings me to my question about the comparisons between a crime against humanity and war crimes and genocide, and the punishment of each crime. Is the punishment greater when it's a genocide compared to if it's a crime against humanity or a war crime? Is there a difference in punishment?
Yeah, that's a great question, Du. And again, I just want to emphasize, I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm going to be very careful about how I answer this question. But I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that you know, we often want to think about these hierarchy of crimes, right? And I mentioned earlier that Lemkin was outraged, you know, that no one at Nuremberg, you know, was prosecuted specifically for genocide, you know, which also creates this impression that genocide is the ultimate crime of crimes, right? And I think for many of us, that's how we think about it. But the issue with genocide is that it is very hard to prosecute genocide, because if you carefully look at the Genocide Convention, there is a specific part that says genocide is the intent to kill in whole or in part a certain group of people, right? And how do you prove intent? Intent is very hard to prove, especially if there is a plot to kill a specific group of people. You know, the plan is not always very clear, you know, that it's to kill them because of their identity groups, right? So we're still disputing those issues in well-known genocide, also genocides around the world. It's very, very hard to prove that. So yeah, I mean, the punishment is I can't answer that, but I think with a lot of the conflict situations that I've looked at where genocide has also taken place, a lot of people are frequently prosecuted for crimes against humanity, for example, but not necessarily for acts of genocide. But I want to emphasize also again that the thing with genocide is it is a group crime, but there are these individual experiences that the victims go through, and so it's not necessarily, I still think it's a good thing if someone is prosecuted for crimes against humanity, even I think preferably we should try and see if we can figure out whether genocide has taken place in a particular situation. But and if we can't do that, we have to prosecute those individuals at the very least for crimes against humanity. Thank you.
And Tally Nate has a similar question to the question I just asked. What are the differences between genocide and crimes against humanity? How is it different?
Sure. Yeah. So again, genocide is directed at the group. It's specifically the destruction of a group. And Lemkin was very specific about this, again, in the coining that term. Genocide is not just the killing of a group, but also the destruction of a group. Whereas crimes against humanity, it's more, it can also be, people are killed in mass, but specifically with genocide, people are killed because they belong to people are killed or destroyed because they belong to a specific group. So there's a lot of nuance there, but I think that's probably the most direct answer to that question.
And then we have another interesting, in your presentation, you mentioned that Lemkin wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt. So Harris Gordon is asking, what was Eleanor Roosevelt's response to Lemkin?
I have not, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I can hear you. Yes.
I did not dig into those letters of correspondence specifically between the two of them, but I do know that she was, giving him some form of support. But you also have to remember that she was working on her own project, the Human Rights Convention, right? Which actually, was adopted by the UN one day after the Genocide Convention was adopted. And Lemkin was not a big fan of the convention, I should say, because he felt like it competed with the Genocide Convention, and he thought it was too broad. So, for example, the Declaration. Sorry, I meant the Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration of Human Rights was a declaration. It was not a convention where that is bound by international law. It was more like a commitment. So it's like the difference between dating someone and being married to someone, right? There's a much stronger commitment, at least in his mind, to the Genocide Convention versus this declaration, which doesn't have teeth under international law. So I think with Eleanor, from from what I've read, at least, she was sympathetic to his cause. She may have helped him to open up a few doors, but there was also a little bit of tension, between their different projects. Lemkin also felt, for example, that the declaration was too wide, and because it, for example, it focused also not just against crimes against humanity, but also on freedom of speech. And so it while he thought that freedom of speech is a problem, and it creates a lot of issues in society, he thought that the greater crime is genocide. And so we're distracting from this, what he deemed to be much more important issue. Also, he thought it would be unrealistic to enforce the declaration, all the issues that are listed in the Human Rights Declaration versus these very, very specific, narrow focus on the Genocide Convention.
Hmm. Okay, there are a few questions that are coming in now thick and fast. So I'll just take a question from Shirley Sapphire, who's asking, after reading Philippe Sand's book, one gets an impression that Lemkin was not a particularly popular person. Do you think that this was a reason that his ideas were not taken more seriously at the time?
I actually think that Lemkin was, I think maybe he had high emotional intelligence. I think he could read people. And so if he wanted to make himself a little bit more of interest to certain people, he worked, he put in a plan of action to do that. He knew who to charm. He knew who to go to. Now, I think what you read in Philippe Sands is partly true, but it's also misleading. It's like, that's why I started off by saying, there were only 7 people at Lemkin's funeral, according to Samantha Power. But it does create the impression that he's not that popular. And there were some individuals, like journalists, who said, he was very pesky. Whenever they tried to dodge him in the halls of the UN, because he would always come up to them and say, "Hey, I have a genocide story for you," right? But at the same time, he was very, very charming, and one of the reasons is because he was fluent in at least 11 different languages, and then he could read another 3 or 4 or so languages. So you're probably familiar with this expression of Nelson Mandela, where he said, if you speak to someone in your language, you can speak to their heads, but if you speak to them in their language, you can speak to their hearts. So he knew where the cultural triggers were in certain individuals, and he could go up to them. He could tell them a joke in their language, or talk about a certain thing that's symbolically important to them, and be able to charm the hell out of them. And in fact, also, if you go through apparently in the archives, there are all these letters of correspondence between Lemkin and a host of people, and he was on good terms with a lot of influential people, government ministers, people who have won literary prizes and all sorts of things, who helped him in his campaign, and I don't think they would have helped him if they also didn't believe in him and or his cause. They always knew that he was very committed to his cause. And in fact, there are also there's evidence that there were a few women who actually proposed to Lemkin, which was very unconventional at the time. I mean, he died in 1959, as I mentioned, right? And there were women who proposed to him, despite the fact that he started to wear more and more shabby clothes the older he got, just because he was running out of money. He quit his jobs early on in his career to pursue this fight for criminalizing genocide. So he didn't have a huge income. He borrowed a lot of money from certain individuals, which meant that I think that may have caused some friction with certain individuals. But I would say I'll take a bit more of a nuanced approach to Lemkin, and saying that I don't think he was unpopular across the board. I think he knew how to charm, who to charm, and if he couldn't get his way with a specific individual, he moved on to the next one, as was the case, as I mentioned earlier with Roosevelt. He went to the public, but that was just the way that Lemkin operated. He did become more and more recluse prior to his death, but I think you have to remember, I think he literally worked himself to death. So I think that factor also played into it. Thank you.
Do we know the 7 people, who the 7 people were that were at his funeral?
No, I can't. No, I can't tell you that. There might be someone else, but I don't know if there's even historical record of who exactly those individuals were. One of the people I know who was at his funeral was at the time, she was a young student who Lemkin met. So I want to say about 2 years before he passed away. He was walking on a university campus or somewhere, and he started talking to this young lady, and then he told her that he wanted to write his memoirs, and so she helped him with his memoirs, and which, as I mentioned, were never published before he passed away. So she was definitely at his funeral, and she was the one that said there were more than 7 people at his funeral. So she disputes that fact, and just on the sideline, the memoirs, which Lemkin titled, why am I blanking on this now? Lemkin called his book totally unofficial, because he was not an official negotiating the Genocide Convention. He was there on the sidelines lobbying all these different countries to adopt his idea of a Genocide Convention. So totally unofficial was then, the manuscript was in the archives, and there was an Australian, I think, with some Dutch heritage, who unearthed it and then decided to actually publish totally unofficial. So in case you're interested to read totally unofficial, written by Lemkin and completed by this Dutch academic later on, you're able to order his book and read firsthand what Lemkin had to say about his journey.
All right. So I have a very complicated question, perhaps even controversial, from Harris Gordon. And he's saying F.W. de Klerk, who died recently, refused to admit the fact that apartheid was a crime against humanity. Could the mass murders and enslavement against Africans under broader colonial rule be regarded as a genocide?
I mean, it's almost like 2 or 3 questions layered in there, which is very, very complicated. Yes, apartheid was a crime against humanity. Apartheid is also a crime under international law, specifically. But yeah, I think some of the mass murders can definitely be regarded as genocide. But I think the issue there would be to show specifically, intent to quote unquote destroy in whole or in part a specific group of people. Now, the issue I think that a lawyer would struggle with is to make the argument, were these crimes of apartheid, or was this genocide that we witnessed? The question there has the word colonial rule also embedded in there. I think a lot of historians, also African historians, will argue apartheid is somewhat different also from colonialism, right? So, but in terms of while the Genocide Convention was being debated, the UK, France, and other great powers actually began to get cold feet because of the Genocide Convention, because they became afraid exactly that they might face prosecution because of their crimes against these colonial people. That's why Lemkin then started to pivot his campaign towards smaller countries who may have experienced some of these things, as opposed to Great Britain and France and some of these other colonial powers who were afraid that they might face prosecution.
All right. I have 1 or 2 more questions. So Beverly Price, who asked, do you think the language of genocide can be expanded to make the atrocities more palatable or accessible to mainstream public? Does that question make sense to you?
I can try to answer that. I think the issue with the language, Beverly, and please feel free to switch on your mic if you want to. Are you specifically asking about the Genocide Convention, the language of the Genocide Convention, or I just want to be clear on what you mean there.
No, thank you very much. No, I'm asking if, you know, it's an isolated word, but surely there's a whole language around genocide. You know, there are. It's like the Eskimos have 1,000 words for snow. So surely there is a development of a whole vernacular around genocide, which can bring the language of genocide into mainstream. We're so protected by the fact that we don't have the language to speak about the crimes. When one reads the details of, for example, Nazi atrocities, you know, it's kind of hidden. It's hidden from mainstream, and so it's a question of how you deal with people's sensitivities to bring it. You know, is it through art only? Can it be through language? That language will develop, say, in the next 50 years or 100 years, of how to talk about genocide in public mainstream discourse. That's my question, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very tricky you know, it's a tricky question. I think you know, I think Lemkin was very consciously aware of that. You know, that's why I think he settled on specifically on the word genocide, to try and find something that could resonate across the board with different people. But one of the things that he did was to try and, as you mentioned, make it more, this idea more accessible to people in different parts of the world. That I didn't talk about is that he actually started a few studies to document genocides that happened over different time periods in different places around the world. So Mdu, for example, mentioned the Herero, for example, in Southwest Africa, and Lemkin started to write about that. He wrote about the persecution that they faced, and so the point for could have different places, it will happen again, you know. You know, it's now that we know it's a crime, maybe we can start studying more systematically where it has happened in different societies, so that, you know, someone in Namibia can also hold on to something that, you know, where they can say, well, this is much more personal for us. It's not just something that happened in distant lands. It's something that happened in Namibia. Let's talk about it, right? And that could help to perhaps develop some language around that. I was quite interested to see that in Zimbabwe, where I lived for 3 years, you know, the Ndebele had a word in Ndebele that roughly translates to genocide. Now, I can't remember the exact word, but it's interesting, you know, that there is that word, you know, given you know, what the you know, the Ndebele faced, especially in the 1980s, you know, between 1983 to 87, you know, the massacres that were committed against the Ndebele, that was genocide also in Zimbabwe. So so I think, like, over time, now that we know there is a crime with a name, you know, perhaps it will become more and more accessible, that we can talk about it, you know, in different settings, and add, you know, our local understandings of these issues to it, so that it's not just abstract for us. It's not something that you know, happened you know, only to a specific group of people in a very distant land.
Maybe the word is kuku rahundi. There's a word I'm looking at. It might mean genocide in Ndebele. But we have another question. Maybe this will be our last question before we close, from Susan Harris. And she's asking, do you think the word has been or can be used today as a political tool by political opponents in order to gain some advantage? What effect, if any, could this have on prosecutions for the crime of genocide?
Yes, of course. Any word can be politicized, and the same can be said for genocide. And we've seen that in some conflict situations that people would readily employ the term genocide because according to the Genocide Convention, if member states that are party to the convention identify that acts of genocide are taking place, they have to, quote unquote, do what they can to prevent or stop genocide. And so there is this perception, as I mentioned, that genocide is the crime of crimes. And so so it's frequently used where groups would say there is a genocide taking place, but it's actually very hard sometimes to come to that conclusion because those plans are not readily available to us. We don't know where's the master blueprint to say, we're going to commit genocide. It's not often in writing, and those who commit genocide often cover up their crimes also, right? And then thirdly, I would say, we often don't know that genocide will take place until it has taken place. So it's very very hard, to come to that determination. Ndu, can you just read the second part of that question again?
Yes. So do you think that the word has been or can be used today as political tool by political opponents in order to gain some advantage? Or what effect, if any, could this have on prosecutions for the crime of genocide?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think, there is a certain process related to prosecuting individuals for their crimes. Now, even if the word is used quite frequently employed, it might create that effect, where if we cry wolf too many times, we don't take it seriously. But I think in terms of prosecuting those who commit genocide, there is a certain process. They go through a legal process where they have to prove certain things. So I don't think it will have a major impact on that. I mean, it's evidence-based at the end of the day. But again, I'm not a lawyer.
And then the rest, thank you very much. Thank you for answering those questions so expertly and so patiently. I know there are a few more comments. The rest of the what's on the chat are just comments. I know Saul has posted a link to a book that was published, Raphael and the Struggle for the Geneva Convention, and he's posted some information about that book that might be helpful to a lot of people. We will save the chat. And for those of you who have registered for this webinar, we will send you the chat. So a lot of this information that's on the chat, you will have access to it. So I would like to say thank you, Dr. Leon Hartwell. Thank you very much for that insightful, for that brilliant presentation and engaging with us the way you did so patiently and answering all of those questions. Thank you very much. Are there any last words that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you everyone for great questions and comments also. And also Saul mentioned there in the chat there, the book that was written by John Cooper. That's an excellent in-depth look at Raphael Lemkin and written from the perspective of a historian. I really enjoyed that book also. which I will encourage everyone here to read. I also send you a link in the group chat. If you want to have a look at my article, you can click on that. I look at specifically at Lemkin, why he was such a great negotiator. You know, I try to tell his story in an interesting way. You know, where I look at him as a very effective communicator also. But thank you also again to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. I love working with you and engaging with your work. Your work is very important. As Raphael Lemkin said, you know, if genocide happened once, it can happen again. So the work that you're doing, especially in educating people about these type of atrocities, you know, is very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hartwell. All the best for your future. Are there any projects perhaps that you are working on that you can tell us about?
Sure. I work a lot on the Balkans these days, especially through the Center for European Policy Analysis. I think related to my work on genocide, you know, I developed an interest in Bosnia and what happened in Srebrenica. And so, you know, I went down what I call the Balkans rabbit hole. I'm analyzing conflicts in the Balkans and ongoing disputes also. So I look at the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, for example, as well as the current situation in Bosnia, where there's a great need to renegotiate their constitution to promote greater diversity and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This was excellent. Thank you. And for everyone, thank you very much for joining us. Please join us again for our future webinars. We are nearing towards the end of our webinar season, so please just keep checking your emails for our next webinars. Thank you very much. Good night, wherever you are joining us from. Good day. I know it's just about noon where you are right now, Dr. Hartwell. Or good morning to whoever is joining us where it's morning. Thank you very much and see you next time.
Thank you.